Welcome to The Adaptive Mind, where we talk with experts about practical, effective approaches to breaking habits and changing behavior. I'm your host, Brady Dowling. I'm glad you're listening. If you've ever wondered why it's so hard to cut down on screen time, or if you've considered actionable steps to reduce screen time, then this episode is for you. The Adaptive Mind is presented by Nurture, the #1 research-based app to help you break habits using self-compassion and science-backed methods. Find the link to install Nurture on iPhone or Android in the show notes. In this episode, I talk with Hassan Aleem, a behavioral scientist, about the unique traits of our phones that make them so appealing to our brains. We touch on the effect smartphones have on parents and children, ethical mobile app design, and we go over specific activities to prevent screen time impulses. Talking to Hassan made a few different things click in my mind about how my phone affects my emotional states and my behaviors. I think you'll find the same thing as you listen. We have today Hassan Aleem, who's a PhD, and he's the co-founder of Nuance Behavior, which is an agency dedicated to leveraging behavioral science to drive digital behavioral change. Hassan's research in neuroaesthetics has explored how aesthetic elements impact decision-making, moods, and identity. And currently, he consults on usability, engagement, and growth for digital products, helping companies integrate behavioral science into their product development for better user outcomes. Hassan, thanks so much for joining and being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Brady. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. I've been looking forward to this for a while. It's a very curious topic for me. So to start, I would say there's probably quite a lot that goes into becoming a behavioral scientist. And I'm curious, what went into your decision to focus on digital products and behavioral change?
Yeah, it's a great question. Because for me, even the journey to behavioral science, I think is a little bit different than others. I have a neuroscience background, but my interest was always in ultimately what people do and what are the models that internally in their mind that's shaping what they do. So that got me to become interested in the applied world, and my exposure to that world was primarily through digital means. I think you can take two routes. One is very policy oriented and shaping healthcare outcomes within a workplace setting or organizational behavior, or you can start to think about behavior at a scale that often leads you to the digital realm, and that's where I ended up being. And that's because I just really, I'm very, I would say, I'm interested in technology. I'm interested in behavioral science. So it was a nice intersection of how can I be impactful in this field where we can try to help people and shape digital interventions, digital apps, platforms that can help change behavior, or just to create better experiences for people. Because so much of our world is digital, and so much of my world is digital. So I think it was sort of just a response to the surroundings that I'm in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I know I personally have always been really into technology. I think probably everybody has some kind of draw to technology, but I feel like phones, especially smartphones, are on a completely different level. Everybody has a smartphone, and it's not quite like video games or other digital things in the past where kind of the more nerdy people might be into them. Everybody has smartphones and most people love them. Why are we so attracted to smartphones? Why do our brains love smartphones so much?
Yeah, I think it's true. I was just talking to my mother a couple of days ago, and she was she normally would love to have a cup of tea at night, but now she has to have a cup of tea and Facebook, and she feels like both of them, without both of them being able to scroll and watch reels, she just cannot actually relax. So what is it that it's not just, it's everyone. When you say everyone, it's everyone. And I have a 4-year, soon to be 4-year-old, and I can just see the allure that she finds in technology. And I'm sure we'll get to those topics, but I think fundamentally it's about novelty. Our brain is an information gathering machine and a sense making machine. So, like a lot of the research that I did tried to look at that topic from the aesthetics world. Like, why do we find certain things beautiful? Why do we, what does beauty mean? And it all really started coming back to information. Beauty is information. It's telling us something. It's salient. So, and oftentimes that's connected with novelty, right? So like, what is new information? And thinking about this as, how can I update my model of what's happening in a way with incoming information? I think smartphones are so attractive because they are essentially magic, right? They are the source of endless information, and most importantly, they're a source of social information, which is very important to be able to get insights into the hive mind, what other people think, how other people feel, what are other people talking about. That is information that is not available elsewhere. Like, you can read a newspaper and get information about current events, but you can't really figure out like what your friend is up to unless you go on your phone and you go on social media. So it's not only information. Why are we all not just on YouTube becoming astronauts? Because information is there, right? It's not just information; it's information that we really care about, and that's mostly social information. Aside from that, I think it's also a mechanism for, because it's so pervasive, like you mentioned, like smartphones are always there. So they are such a magnet for habitual behavior. And I think it's sort of like the self-reinforcing thing where, like, imagine if there's something else that you carried around you and looked at just as much as you did your phone. I don't think you can. And I think if you did, like, you would be like, your life would sort of revolve around. And that makes a lot of sense because you start to associate automatic behaviors to it. So I think the other reason that phones are so attractive is because of just their sheer presence and availability. They tend to get connected to a lot of internal states that we have. So they end up, making us happy when we're sad. They end up making us, giving us, a lift when we're bored. And they'll end up sort of being like a stress management mechanism, way to sort of like, cope with things. So it's just like our go-to resource for many, many things. I think combined, that's sort of like the thing. It's just not just a novelty, not just one type of novelty, but just like availability and access.
Now you have me thinking, like, what else can I carry and look at 24/7 that would make me more interested in it and make me like positively productive toward this thing. Thinking about like a time during the day when I'm like, I'm going to go check my phone. What, at a high level, what is happening in my mind, in my brain at that point when I'm like having that almost an itch and sometimes even an urge if I feel like I'm being restricted?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't hesitate to call it an urge or an impulse. I think it's, I think if you're not saying that, you're sort of lying to yourself at this point. What I think is happening, at a high level is this loop of a trigger that's internal most of the times, and that's why most people are probably not aware of it. And this might be, boredom. You might just be like, okay, when I have to go wait for my order at a restaurant, I'm sitting and I'm bored. That's a trigger. I'm going to pull up my phone. And you see, it's not like you think, I should pull out my phone. Like, boredom, pull up my phone. It could be that you got off a very stressful client call, or you just got out of a meeting or something, and you're anxious. And the first thing you do is you pull out your phone and sort of vent. So this trigger there is stress, and you're trying to cope with that stress. Could just be anxiety, where anytime, I think what I would say, the common theme is that there is a period where we are not occupied, and within that period, certain things like boredom and anxiety or other unwanted thoughts come up. And those are the triggers that then lead us to use our phones as a coping mechanism. So that sort of trigger, we pull out our phone, and that alleviates the anxiety. So at a high level, what's happening in your brain is you're getting a stress response, or even boredom you could consider a stress response, an anxiety response, and you're using your phone, and that's immediately bringing down that stress response. So I think it is very much a adaptive thing that your brain is trying to do. But most of the time it's, people aren't aware of it. And adaptive in the sense that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing to do. Like maybe it's worthwhile to think about, well, why can't I deal with boredom, or what is the underlying stress that I should actually address, and not, try to punt down the line. But in the immediate short term, it is very adaptive. It is something that is going to fix the boredom and the anxiety and everything. And that just, I think oftentimes people think of dopamine when it comes to that, but it's not necessarily so much dopamine. It's just it's more so a decrease in, like you might have a high spike in cortisol, or you might have, a change in serotonin levels. So it's very much related to stress and how you're feeling at the moment. So endorphins, or more like, pleasure related things. We can definitely get to dopamine later, because it obviously plays a role, but it's not so much that you're looking for that hit, hit of dopamine, but more so you're looking for that release in whatever discomfort that you're feeling.
Yeah. You mentioned your almost 4-year-old, and I'm just thinking about my 4-year-old. I also have a 4-year-old, and sometimes he'll be crying so much, and I'm trying to console him, and he's like, I think if I watch Paw Patrol, it'll be better. And I'm like, no, it's already started. Like, how do you understand? Like, he already gets that he's going to be relieved. And I know he can be manipulative sometimes, but I think he's genuinely thinking like, this will make me feel better. And he's honestly right that it will. Because,
and more insightful than we are as adults.
Yeah. I'm thinking also about some people who have gone on this like dumb phone kick. Like some people use a dumb phone instead of a smartphone because they're like, this is a better way to do it. I feel like there's probably people in different camps, and there's probably a spectrum of like how smartphones can be used in the best way. Do you feel like we're better off without smartphones?
I became very close to becoming one of those people, and I'm still grappling with if I can do that. But I think it's challenging because, especially when you have a kid, having access to a smartphone to like know where the nearest thing is, right? And so like dumb phones, right now I think part of it is that we don't have the ideal dumb phone. I think it's either just so dumb that it doesn't do like some of the things that you should be able to do, which is like take a picture of a funny thing that your kid is doing, to be able to share that or to look at it. So, but at the same time, like, then yes, I do think it's nice to be able to separate at least those different sources of information. And I personally have tried to do that in a way where it's not necessarily that I would say, let's say I've given my smartphone a lobotomy because I've removed all social media apps, which I think is a common practice of people that are really trying to think about their smartphone usage. I think that is maybe the right balance, where you can, one, like remove all social media and only access it on the desktop. So not saying remove social media from your life. That's up to you. I think there's benefits to having social media, especially in the type of world that we live in, where if you remove that, you're essentially just never seeing people. So it's just an unfortunate reality, and we need social media. So that's where I grapple with the need for a smartphone. Is not that, I think that things that are on it are things that we probably do need, especially the world that we live in, which is like to be able to listen to others, to see what your friends are doing, to be able to stay in touch with them. But we can still do that through, all these services have their desktop and web apps. So like we can still do that. It's not like you have to cut yourself off from that. And I do think also that there's ways around it where like we can sort of, funnily enough, like instead of using a dumb phone, like I sort of use multiple layers of technology to sort of, help me not have to always pull up my phone, which is, using an Apple Watch, using like Ray-Ban Meta glasses, because those will just give me, while I'm walking, like the notification I can reply and I don't have to pull up my phone. So I think, going back to like it's this gravity that smartphones have, because they can do so much more than the task that you open them for. That like one way is to just use a dumb phone, but another way is to just like make it so that you only use it when you really need it, and then try to like maybe partition out the things that make smartphones not so useful and perhaps even harmful.
Yeah, it sounds like a continuation of our conversation, right? Like not using this single device as the cure-all for all negative emotions that we have, but also not using it as the cure-all for all like electronic needs that we have. So maybe distributing that out to different devices that are useful in specific times and in specific places. So taking those things into account, what would you say are some of the best things I can do for my brain and my mind with regards to technology?
Yeah, I think, yeah, sort of building on that, I think what we sort of ended on is like thinking about dedicated platforms. If you have to still, if you still like to read, like, then Kindle is a dedicated device just for reading. Is still an electric device or digital device. So if you do have to rely on those things, and dealing with smartphones, you can try to partition that out. I do struggle with recommending the sort of built-in digital well-being that both like Android and iOS has. Partly because if you don't do some of the other things, if you still have Instagram on your phone, it's just incredibly easy to just go through that. And what you actually end up doing is like adding a little bit of effort to the reward. And humans actually enjoy effortful rewards. So like you're actually sort of making it like, oh, okay, this was totally worth it. Like I went through this and I ended up finding out that like, yes, I did have a like from somebody, or a friend request or something. So I've found that like it can actually hurt. But what you can do is like use that in a broad sense to add structure to your day. So focus time, or do not disturb time, and like a shortcut on iOS to triple click the power button and then turn it all into black and white to like really reduce the salience of things. So those are sort of general mechanisms, right? Because like those are not trying to like add a barrier, but they're trying to just shape the way you think about your phone. I think you have to think beyond. Like I think once you've picked up your phone, it's a little almost like it's a little bit too late already. And if you're trying to add like mechanisms there, if you haven't made changes within your phone, like if everything is there, it's just too attractive in a force, and eventually I think you're going to break. And I maybe I'm speaking from my own experience where I've tried all these things, and maybe I'm sure there's other people that are have different experiences, but I've found what's helped me is to think about technology as a tool, right? So like well, what is the reason to have my phone right now? What is the reason to like even like if you're working, like there's studies that show that just having the phone within eyesight is something that's distracting, right? So like just speaking to the gravity of things. So like, yes, you could have all the digital well-being tools on your phone, but if even its presence is distracting, then maybe you need to think about, having it in a different room when you actually shouldn't be using it, or just having set hours when you're using your phone. I don't want to adopt a position where, like I do think it's, like I said, adaptive and sometimes necessary to rely on your phone for just like, mindless scrolling. But it's more so just monitoring that. So self-awareness around what are you actually doing, I think is a good way. Because I think most of us are not self-aware, and most of us are not working at a level of our environmental behavioral change that's, I would say like, high enough to shape that change. Like we might want to, I think it's, I haven't used any of those products where you can lock your phone, but I'm curious about those that you have experience with that. But I can see that being, I don't know, sort of on the edge with those things.
Yeah, I have considered things like that. I haven't gone into that. I've worried that, like you said, adding some kind of friction and overcoming that friction sometimes is reinforcing and seems like a reward. And I'd be curious to just have you talk about like a little bit more about the dopamine loop that you referenced earlier and how that plays into that particular scenario. One thing I wanted to comment on before we get into that is you talked about how smartphones just being around can be distracting and cause some kind of cognitive load and keep our minds aloof a little bit. And not to make this all about our 4-year-olds, but I noticed that when I put my 4-year-old down to bed, we got in this routine of doing a meditation together. And so I would have my phone with me so that we could do a meditation from my phone in preparation for that. And I noticed that it was just like, even when we were going through other parts of his bedtime routine, I was distracted just because my phone was in my pocket. And I always had that access. And I could, if I had a thought that I thought was important, I could note it down or like do whatever. And after a while, I was just like, we can do some other kind of meditation just ourselves, or we can read a book, but I have to put the phone away, because it is, like you said, it's just, it causes my mind to go elsewhere.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I've definitely come into the same situation where, yeah, even your child can sort of be like, oh, that's the same device that you can, I think if they're picking up on it, like that's the same device that sometimes we watch something on, or like I know can take pictures or do funny Snapchat filters. Like, it's the barrier to entry is so low, and it's designed to be so low. And one thing I would add to that is like exactly what you're saying, is thinking about analog ways to like sort of ground yourself. And I know like there's a huge deep reading movement now, which I am trying to practice myself as well, is like, just the idea that like, it's just the way that we've been conditioned to use our phones. Like we are just like, we aren't conditioned to spend a lot of time on one screen in a phone. So like we constantly want to be scrolling on a lot of reading apps or scrolling apps. So they almost force you not to immerse yourself. And there's other, aspects about books where the ability to sort of flip back and forth and have a physical mental model of like where one thought piece was and where another was, and sort of think about like, okay, I read this long ago. Like all of that sort of disappears, and it's just one, infinite scroll. Like it really shapes like how you interact with the world. So like I do like the idea of like grounding yourself by like, perhaps doing a meditation that's on a piece of paper, or like, something that just only does meditation, right? Like, and sort of the inverse of that, if you imagine like somebody trying to sell you a book, it's a physical book, but it can also, take pictures. You'd be like, why would you add a camera to my book? But your smartphone is that, like it is a Kindle, but it's also a camera, like, and somebody was like, well, wait, in your book, and I can also add Instagram. It's like, no, don't do that. I just want to read a book. It's like, so we are trying to do that with our phones too, but it's funny because we constantly like, we're okay with it because it's just the way to access anything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. It's like our panacea for really anything that's not food. And sometimes exactly. It's even the panacea for that.
Yeah, great. Yeah. I know you asked about the sort of hitting on the dopamine loop. I think that's super interesting to talk about, because that's, I would say, the most commonly used word when we talk about intersection of like neuroscience and sort of like phone. Wouldn't even call it addiction, but like phone dependency.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's obviously there, but I think what the recent sort of discourse on this has shown is reflecting on what we've known from neuroscience research, at least all along, is that dopamine very initially was thought about like, okay, it seems to be spiking when there's reward, and then we started to learn quickly there's actually a learning and prediction signal, and then it's telling you like. And then it's also a saliency signal. It's telling you where you can expect rewards, right? So you can learn that one area is going to give me a reward. So like that becomes salient. And there's experiments that you can do where you can just associate rewards with a random shape and ask people to do a different task. And you can see that like they cannot help but look in eye tracking studies at that shape, because their eyes are just like, I'm going to get something here, even though the actual reward is going to come from them completing the task. It becomes like a force of its own. So I see dopamine as this like one learning signal, like, but broadly a saliency signal. And this wanting, the term in neuroscience is incentive salience. So this idea of like where can I expect rewards from, and once you get that reward, like how can I update my model so that I get as much reward as I expect? Like, am I getting too little? Am I getting too much? So where I feel like this plays in with smartphone usage and like our digital usage in general is like, it's that internal loop of saliency, right? Like you're essentially taking so many different things, like of like we're talking about, like if we were to sort of just blast out the all the things that we can fit into a phone, which is almost anything, and all the saliencies attached with it. Now you're putting all of that in one thing, so it's like this super salient device. And it's a device that has this incredible variance in what you can learn. So like there is this constant updating of like, well, like I could learn like it just, who knows what I'll learn next time, and who knows, not only like you can imagine like a gambling setting, it's who knows what I'll learn in this vertical of like winning money, but here it's like who knows what I'll learn in like one of these possible things or multiple things, where I might get an email that's about a job that I applied to, or might get like a like on a post that I made, or I might get like a message from somebody that I have a crush on or something. It's like so many different ways to get rewards and so many things to learn from. So I think it's like it would be very, very silly for our brains not to prioritize this device, because it's like an immense source for learning. It's an immense source for navigating the world, for information. And that's exactly what dopamine is designed to do. It's designed to, like, I like to, I come from this aesthetics world where I like to think of like aesthetics also as a source of information and salience. And I like to imagine that like a newborn baby has like these priors that, they know that mom's face is important, and we know that from where they look. There's like this pay special attention, but essentially as you, from nature and from the nurture, you're actually learning how to turn this like essentially black and white or grayscale picture in the world to like things that sort of start to glow a little bit more. And I think dopamine is what's helping you do that. And your phone is like that attractive force. It sort of beckons you, I think, is how I would put it.
Yeah. You talking about babies and being drawn to shapes makes me think of this book that I found several years ago called, I think, Experimenting on Babies. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it basically lists out like all these different experiments. Essentially what you were saying, if you put like a triangle and this shape near a baby who's, I don't know, it says the age range, then they're going to pick, this shape. And so it's a lot of very interesting thought experiments that are probably kind of the basis of what you're saying there. Like we're kind of just hardwired to do certain things and be drawn to visually aesthetic things. And a lot of times our smartphones kind of play off of that.
Yeah, I think this is not like some hidden secret, right? I think since like the Apple Store, like apps started becoming a thing, since then, like what is some of the most brilliant people in the world have been like trying to figure out like how can we shorten the distance and really like get people to like these are psychologists, these are all people that are game designers, like that are very aware of developmental psychologists, that are aware of like these things. And I think that's sort of what we're up against. I think it's very much like, well, the behavioral design that's been put in and the energy that's been put into creating these UIs and this atmosphere, the digital world is not like, it's been thought out. And so I think the least we can do is go into it with our own sense of self-awareness that like I am going to a place that has been designed to manipulate me in some way, and that's okay. But I should be aware of like when it's manipulating me in a way that I am not okay with, right? So I think that's I just wanted to put a sort of finer point on that, because I think it's it sort of really makes you think about like what we're up against.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is probably a conversation for another time, but what we're up against makes me think a lot about the changes in AI and kind of the advancements there, and what kind of role that's going to have in really the future of the world, but also how our relationship is with technology, how our relationship is with AI. So yeah, we won't get into that too much, but it definitely would be a very interesting topic of conversation. I guess to close, I would ask you this question about your work, which is, are you ever worried that your work specifically is feeding into these kind of things? Or maybe are there things that you do to kind of be aware and cautious of that?
Yeah, and I think I very much am, and I the way that not just me, but everybody else at Nuance thinks about this is thankfully we're aligned on this, right? And I think that's not always the case with people that are in the industry, because clearly there's quick ways and easy ways to get people essentially hooked on something. And the way we like to sort of think about it is like, those are what we like to think of like little e engagement and big E engagement, which is like, things that people actually came and used your app for. So we like to work out holistic ways where, we know fundamentally that we do have to engage people. Like just having a product that is useful and has been proven to work, if you were to do it, is not enough. When we know that just how digital tools work and how behavior works, like to get people to engage, you have to give them some sort of quick wins, some sort of feedback, some sort of enjoyment. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think you find that everywhere where people are trying to get you to do something, there's associated rewards with it. Mm-hmm. It's just that when we're in the digital world, you're competing with a ton of other people for your same attention. So to do that, you sometimes have to do some, maybe you see a lot of like, dark patterns or things like that become forces of their own. So in my work specifically, we try to be, I guess, aware, first of all, of that, and work with organizations that we feel like are aligned with that philosophy as well. So I think that's probably the first line of defense, is that, we're not going to be working with an organization that only cares about the number of clicks. Like, we try to immediately get them towards like, well, what is your, not just your KPI, what's your key like behavior that you're after? And how are we making sure that this is actually feeding into that? And then how are we making sure that there's an off ramp, right? So like, let's say you do have to do some of these immediate engagement mechanisms to get people's attention, to get them on the platform. Can we think about how that doesn't become a force of its own, or maybe an off ramp eventually, and allow for growth? So I think just taking that philosophy and being a little bit selective about, or quite selective about, who we work with and what their philosophies are. And now, frankly, I think that's not as hard of a topic, because it's I think more and more the sort of things we're talking about is just everybody is aware of that. And like clients that we have say like, well, I just don't want another app. Like I think it's like we've reached a point of saturation where I think we're all aware that like, everybody's trying to get our attention all the time, and people don't want to play that game anymore. So how can they sort of step outside the game? And that's not an easy challenge, but that's sort of the challenge that we try to meet.
Yeah, that's cool. And it does seem like there is certainly a heightened awareness from a lot of people, and a heightened interest in kind of having this approach that you mentioned, that, okay, let's not just spend our whole lives on our smartphones, and let's not try to get other people to do that as well. Because like people get it. They get it that the smartphones are drawing them in, and they don't always want to be drawn in like that. So that's awesome that you take that stance and that approach. Okay, is there anything else that you think would be helpful to cover, or things that you wanted to mention before we close?
I think most people, like you said, are dealing with some sort of phone dependency. And I think awareness is a great first step. Understanding the triggers that are causing it, and then figuring out ways to circumvent it by, just trying to think of like, okay, how can I ground myself? So like, have I had enough time away from screens? And, one of the things like, to sort of leave it off on a practical note is like things that I've found helpful. Of course, like if you can go for a walk, I think that's probably one of the best things, like, go for a walk without any technology on you. And, the whole idea of like rewilding your attention. But I think, I've also been thinking about like, how when you go to a perfume store and you sort of have to reset your palette. I think when we're using digital tools all day, we're just like switching from big laptop to little screen to bigger screen to like, it's like just different things. And I think there's a sense of like derealization and depersonalization that I'm sure we'll start to find. I think it's already been found in VR, where like, kids that are exposed to VR for even a short period of time start to feel like this sense of like detachment to themselves. And I think I'm sure at some level we're all feeling that. So what is an analog of smelling coffee between perfumes? I think, that's a walk is one way to do that. I do think what I've landed on personally, and I'd be curious to see if the listeners like try this out and feel like it's useful to them, is cooking is actually one of those things, because it's something, I think cooking or playing sports, I think both of those things. So like you have to do something where it would be too much of a risk not to use your phone. Or it's too involved where if you got distracted, like it would just, so if you're cooking, you could, yes, you can still be on your phone, but it's just like takes away from the process and you probably won't do it. So if you do cooking right, and if you want to cook well, like you kind of have to pay attention. If you're playing sports, like you can't be like on your phone while your teammate's trying to pass you a basketball, right? Like it just forces you out of that. Like there's no way you can be on your phone. So I think, how can you put yourself in that position? And it's hard to do, because if you think about it, like theoretically you would think, well, driving a car should be one of those things, but we know like of all this distracted driving statistics, like nobody's saying like, another person reading a book today got in a car crash because the book was just so enthralling. It's like, no, like this is so, like we're willing to implicitly putting our lives at risk. So finding activities where you cannot, there's no way that you could use your phone in it. And I found that, playing sports like tennis, basketball, that's what I do. There's no way I could use my phone while doing those things. And like it's forced detachment from my phone. And cooking, not quite forced detachment, because you could still do it, but it's one of those things where I feel like it's so visceral, where like, you're cutting something, you're putting something, you're going to eat it later. You can't just, do it halfway, if you're serious about it. So I don't know, just some tips in terms of like we're not going to just deal with the smartphone problem. It's only going to get probably more pervasive, like you said, with AI, but like, how can we ground ourselves is probably maybe worth mentioning.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I totally can connect with that. I played basketball and I started to learn to surf several years ago. And I was like really, actually before I started learning that, I was very stressed out about something and consuming my thoughts. And then it was like I could not think about anything else besides trying to surf and just getting knocked over. So yeah, nice. I totally can connect with that. Well, thank you so much. I think a lot of this has been very insightful and really interesting for me. And I think that listeners will find it to be the same. Before we go, where can people find you?
On digital platforms. Unfortunately, that's where our lives are. But if you do want to write me a letter, I'd be happy to read it. But on LinkedIn is the easiest way. But maybe, you can email me, Hassan@nuancebehavior.com. I feel like maybe that might be the closest we can get to the analog version of things. And yeah, both of those things, I think you can visit our website, nuancebehavior.com as well.
Okay, great. Awesome. We'll include that in the show notes. And thank you again, Hassan. This is great.
Thank you, Brady. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Adaptive Mind, brought to you by Nurture, the research-based app for overcoming unwanted or addictive behaviors. I hope you found our conversation insightful and inspiring. If you did, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and continue bringing these learnings to people that need them. Remember that you have an adaptive mind that does incredible things every day, and it's capable of even more. We'll see you in the next episode.